Hello, welcome to the second video. In this video, we're going to continue modifying the blood pressure app so that it implements fragments, whereas originally it was just a single activity app. Before, what we did was we took that app, that single activity app, and added 2 static layout fragments, and we also added a landscape variation layout so that we would position the 2 fragments side by side. And here I can show you that on the emulator. We already have it running, and you can see that in landscape orientation we have the input fragment on the left and the follow-up recommendation fragment on the right. Okay. But what we want to do now, well, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to add support for device rotation, so that way we don't lose the data that's on screen. We're going to implement fragment communication, so that way when the data appears in the when the data changes in the input fragment, the follow-up recommendation will display the follow-up recommendation text. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to convert those static layout fragments to dynamic code fragments. Okay, so let's start with the first item, and the first item is to support device rotation, and we're going to do that first on the input fragment, and we'll do the follow-up recommendation fragment a little bit later. But what we need to do, we need to make 2 changes. One is we need to make a call to a fragment method called setRetaininstance. And what that method does is it prevents the fragment from being destroyed. It actually retains the fragment object intact. So we don't lose the instance variable values. As you can see here, I just opened up the input fragment, and these instance variables will not change. Okay, and you call setRetaininstance early in the fragment construction callback sequence, and a good place to do that is in onCreateView. So I'm going to add onCreateView here. I'm just going to override, I'm sorry, onCreate, not onCreateView. So we're going to add onCreate, and it's going to call setRetaininstance. I'm going to pass true because we want to retain the instance, and these values won't be cleared out and reset. So they're just going to hold their original value. However, this isn't going to be the total answer. And the reason for that is because when the device rotates or the configuration changes, the callback sequence occurs again, the fragment callback sequence. And onCreateView is then going to be called. And once onCreateView is called, this inflate call is going to be executed. And what that does is that essentially repaints the screen, repaints the layout. And when that happens, some widgets lose their contents. Edit text widgets, interestingly enough, do not lose their contents, but text view widgets do. And so we display the category in a text view widget, and that turns out to lose its content. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go down to the bottom of onCreateView, and I'm going to add this little bit of code here. I'm going to test to see if the mCategory instance variable has been set. And if it has been set, I'm just going to reset the text of the category view. And I'm just basically going to duplicate this line up here. Let me just this line right here. So Should be able to run this now, and we will see how we preserve the blood pressure category. I'm going to enter in some typical values. Let's say 115 and 70. That's fairly low. Okay, normal blood pressure. So we see the category right there. There's no follow-up recommendation yet because we haven't implemented the ability to display it yet, but we will. Now, if I rotate the device, we retain the category view. It does not get deleted. Okay, so that was the first step for this video. Now what we're going to do is we're going to implement fragment communication so that we can display the recommendation text. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to make modifications to the fragment that receives the initial, well, the fragment that gets updated, and that's going to be the input fragment. That is going to get new data. Once it gets new data, it needs to communicate. It's going to calculate the category, and then it's going to communicate that category value to the follow-up recommendation fragment. The thing is, it's not going to communicate it directly to the recommendation fragment. And the reason why is because we want fragments to be independent of each other. We want them to be completely reusable and not have to necessarily work with any other fragment. We want to keep them as independent as possible. And so what that means is that all communications between fragments has to go through the hosting activity. And in that case, in our case here, that activity is going to be the main activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some modifications to input fragment so that it passes up the value of the category to the main activity. And then the main activity is going to then call down into the follow-up fragment and pass that value to the follow-up fragment, which is then going to display the recommendation text. All right, we're going to make 4 modifications to the input fragment, 2 modifications to main activity, and 1 modification to follow-up fragment. So the complexity decreases. It starts with the most in the input fragment, half that much in the main activity, and then half that again in the follow-up activity. All right, so let's start with the input fragment, and we're going to make 4 modifications. We're going to give it a interface definition. We're going to implement an interface definition, a Java interface definition. Then we're going to add an instance variable which holds an object that implements that interface. And then we're going to add a callback Unattach, which is going to assign the object that implements that interface to our instance variable. And then we're going to call the method defined in the interface on the interface object. That's a lot, and you'll see what I'm talking about as I make the modifications here. So one of the first things that we're going to do is we are going to implement the interface. So right here, right after category here, we're going to implement the interface, and that's going to be like so. It's going to be public interface follow-up handler. It's going to have one method specification, and we're going to call it display follow-up. And it's going to take a single argument, an integer, which corresponds to the category value. And that's all that goes into the follow-up handler. Now next, we're going to add an instance variable which holds an object that implements that interface. So I'm going to add the following. Follow-up handler, and I'm going to give it the name follow-up handler. All right, that's the second modification. Now the third modification is where we're going to assign to the follow-up handler, and we're going to do that in Unattach. Unattach is a callback that gets called when the fragment is attached to its hosting activity. So because it's an overridden method, we're going to add it in the usual way. It's not Unattach Fragments, it's Unattach, because it's the fragment is being attached to the activity. And in Unattach, we're going to add the following code. Now here in Unattach, this is going to get called when the fragment is being attached to the parent activity. The context here is the parent activity. Activity derives from context. So we're going to get a reference to the main activity here. And what we want to do first is we want to make sure that the activity that's being passed in implements the interface that we defined. And the way we do that is we use the instance of operator, and we're going to check to see if the context or the activity that's being passed in is an instance of follow-up handler. If it is, we are just going to assign the context, the activity, to our local variable. We're going to cast it to the interface type. Now, if it is not an instance of follow-up handler, then we've got a problem that we can't really do anything about. So we're going to throw an exception. We'll give some reasonably understandable text here. All right, and this is our Unattach. So here is where we assign to that local variable. All right, now once we've assigned to the local variable, we can then make a call on it, and we can call the method that we defined here. We can call, I'm sorry, the display follow-up method. And we're going to make that call where we would have previously displayed the follow-up text, the follow-up recommendation text. And we commented that code out. This is where we set the follow-up recommendation text when this code was in the main activity. So now that it's in the fragment, we're going to add, let me just see if I can get in here. Let me in. Here, I'll just do it here. Okay, so right there is where we're going to make the call to our follow-up handler. And we're going to call the only method that it knows about, and we're going to pass it the category. And those are all the modifications that we're going to make to the input fragment. All right. So now we're going to make two modifications to the main activity. And the first modification that we're going to make to the main activity is we're going to make it implement that interface that we just defined. And we're going to have to specify the scope here, and the scope is input fragment. And we're going to type in follow-up handler. You know what, let's put that on another line just to make it a little bit clearer. All right. Now it's giving me an error here because I haven't implemented the interface methods, and it's going to give me the opportunity to do that automatically. So Android Studio is going to do that. So I'm going to click on that intention and click on implement methods, and it's going to ask me what method I want to implement, and I want to implement display follow-up. So I'm going to click OK on that, and it adds it to the class, and it added it right after onCreate here. So in this method, we are going to call the method, a method in follow-up fragment. And we haven't defined the method in follow-up fragment yet, so when I type it in, it's going to be colored red. That'll change once we define the method in the follow-up fragment. But first we have to find the follow-up fragment. We have to get a reference to the follow-up fragment. And the way to do that is as follows. Okay, I'm going to define a local variable of the follow-up fragment type and assign it to, well, I'm going to, oops, is that correct? Follow-up fragment is what we want. And I'm going to make a call to get support fragment manager. And then we're going to find fragment by ID. And I'm going to specify the fragment ID. And that fragment is fragment follow-up. Now that I have a reference to the fragment, I am going to call a method that I'm going to define in the fragment. I haven't defined it yet, so it's going to come out in red. And that's okay. All right. And those are the two modifications that we're going to make to the main activity. Now all we need to do is add the show follow-up method to the follow-up fragment. And we're just going to go ahead and do that. Okay, and so, you know what, I'll put that at the end here. So we're going to have public void show follow-up, I think is what I call that. And it's going to take an int. It's going to be category. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type in follow-up text view dot set text m recommendations, and we're going to index into the recommendations with the category value that we've passed in. And that is all of the modifications that we need to make. So let's try to run this and see what happens. Okay. Once again, we will add. Let's make it a high value so we get a longer recommendation. And sure enough, we have our text here now. We've implemented device rotation. We're going to do the last thing now, and that's going to be device rotation handling for the follow-up fragment. So if I do that, the recommendation goes away. There is a fairly simple way of preserving the text in a text view on rotation. So we're going to do yet a slightly different way of preserving rotation, preserving text upon device rotation. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to change an attribute on this text view here. And so if we go down to fragment follow-up and we select that and we set the attribute freezes text we should then have that text preserved. So let's go ahead with this. Let's see if that does the trick. If it doesn't do the trick, we're gonna we'll resort to our set retained instance. But let's just see if this will do the trick. Gradle is building. Anticipation mounts. Oh, we do have a little bit of a problem here. Oh, no problem. Yeah, that got fixed. All right, so let's see what happens. Okay, again, we're going to put in a high value here, so let's put in 150 and 110. Diagnose. We get hypertension. So let's see if that set freezes text works. Sure enough, it works. So we've pretty much completed the last part of, well, the second to last part. We got one more part left, and that is converting the fragments to dynamic code fragments. Okay, we've implemented device rotation handling. We've done that in two ways. We did that with the set retain instance variable call for this first fragment, and we did it in the second fragment with the set freezes text attribute change. We've implemented fragment communication, and the way we did that was we modified the calling fragment, the caller, by adding an interface instance variable, an Unattach method call where we assign the passed in activity to the instance, to the interface instance variable, and then we call the function in the interface where we need to, where we would normally display the follow-up recommendation text. Okay, those were the four modifications that we make to the caller, in this case, input fragment. In the activity, we make two changes. We have the activity implement the interface that we defined in the caller. And then we implement the method of the interface. And what we do here is we track down, we use the fragment manager here, the get support fragment manager call to get the support fragment manager. We look up the fragment that we want to pass our data to. We look that up, we get a reference to that fragment, and then we call a method in the receiving fragment, in this case, show follow-up. And then the last change is we add the show follow-up method to the receiving fragment, which is follow-up fragment. And in this case, we added the method. And what we do here is we then call we call set text and set the text appropriately. And one of the last things we did is we've supported rotation here by having the text widget here setting its freezes text attribute to true, and that preserves the text in the widget and retains it across device configuration changes. The last thing that we want to do here is we want to implement dynamic runtime fragments. And to do that, we don't need to make any further modifications to the fragments. To do this, we will modify main activity. Okay, let's get rid of this. We don't need this anymore. That was old code that handled rotation for the activity. And so to implement dynamic fragments, we're going to remove the static layout fragments in our activity layout. We're gonna change those. We're gonna remove those, and we're gonna replace them with frame layouts. And those frame layouts are going to be holders for our dynamic code fragments. And so what we should do first is go ahead and replace these. And so what I will do here is I will type in frame layout. All right, I'm going to keep the IDs as they are. Do that here as well. We no longer need this explicit reference to a fragment class because we're going to set that at runtime. Okay, so now we have two frame layouts, and we're going to do the same for the landscape. Going to remove that. Now I could have just deleted these from the design view and then dragged out some frame layouts as well, but same difference. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah. Okay. Now that we've made that change, we're going to go to the activity, and we're going to make the changes in on create. And so what we're going to do is on create, we are going to add our fragments to those frame layouts. And the thing is, we only want to do this the first time through. We don't want to do this subsequently on rotations, because that information, we don't need to re-add fragments in that case. We just need to do it the first time. So to do that, I'm going to put in a test here to ensure that saved instance state is null. That will tell me that this is the first time through. Upon rotation, previously when we were rotating the activity-based app, we would, saved instance state is a bundle. So what we would do is we would save our the data that we want to preserve across the rotation to the saved instance state bundle, and then we would test to see if it was non-null, and that would tell us whether or not the there was data there, or that this was a recreation of the activity. Well, it turns out that saved instance state is always null the first time through, and it's always non-null on the subsequent recreations of the activity, whether or not data has been saved to the bundle. So this is a good flag to tell us whether or not this is the first time through on create or a subsequent time through on create. And so the first time through on create, we're going to add our fragments. So to add our fragments, we need a handle, a reference to the fragment manager. And I'm going to add that code right here. You're going to get the support fragment manager. And I am going to add the first fragment. And it's, I think what it's doing is, I think we need the different, we don't want this fragment manager, we want the support fragment manager. Let's let Android Studio fix this for us. That's not exactly the way I want it to be fixed. It's pretty verbose. I don't want to remove the variable. What I want to do is I want to do this. I want to replace here. I'm going to do this manually. We're going to add support v4.app fragment manager, and I should be able to eliminate this, and we should be good to go. And I think we are. Yes, great. Okay. So now that I've got the fragment manager, I am going to find the frame layout that I want to add my fragments to, or my first fragment to. So I'm going to put in a test here, find view by ID, and r.id.fragment input. We're going to add our input fragment here. If it's non-null, that means we found it. It's present, and we're going to add our fragment, our input fragment to it. And so we're going to instantiate an input fragment. All right. Okay. And now that we have it instantiated, we are going to add it using the fragment manager, the transaction facility of the fragment manager. Fragments, dynamic fragments are added and replaced using transactions. And this is how we do that. We type in fragment manager, begin transaction. And we're going to use this chaining calls method here and add to our ID follow-up fragment. I'm sorry, input fragment. Fragment input. We are going to add the input fragment that we just instantiated. And then the last thing we do here is we're going to commit the transaction. This is a lot like transactions in a SQL database here. Let's make this a little bit more readable. Let's bring this down a line if we can. Can we do that? Yeah. You know what? Let's bring the dot down. Just make it a little. Okay. All right. So that's our first fragment. Let's add the second one. Same procedure here, except this time we're going to look for the follow-up fragment. Fragment follow-up. If it is not equal to null, we're going to instantiate the follow-up fragment. Okay. Same procedure here. We're going to begin a transaction. We're going to add r.id.fragment follow-up. And we're going to add the follow-up fragment. And we're going to commit it. All right, so this should, this hopefully will work. So let's give it a run. So now what we did now is we changed, we removed the fragment tags from the layouts, and we replaced them with frame layouts that are not specifically assigned fragments. They're no longer specifically assigned fragments. They just have a fragment ID. They can hold any fragment. Okay, and we did that to both the profile and the landscape variations of a layout. Okay, and then once we did that, we went back up to the main activity to onCreate, and we checked to see if this was the initial call to onCreate, and if so, we then called the fragment manager. We got a reference to the fragment manager, and we then instantiated each fragment and then started a transaction with the fragment manager, which allowed us to add each fragment, and then we and then committed the transaction, and we did that. We repeated that for each fragment. So let's see if this works. Well, getting closer. Okay, looks like it worked. It works. Okay, and there you have runtime or dynamic code fragments. See you next time.